So still, the argument would be that a comprehensive and honest disclosure is of utmost importance. Community members and scientists in support who have been studying the issue argue that there can be no adequate cleanup without actually knowing what is in there, right? And I can give you an example of La Chiva Cay, or El Cayo La Chiva, in which the Navy for years insisted that it had not bombed, and yet recently had to admit to unexploded ordnance both inland and surrounding waters. And to give you a sense of this is a cay, Un Cayo, that has been basically open to the public for years, right? And only recently been admitted that there's unexploded ordnance around the area. But the problem, however, goes beyond an acknowledgement of bombing and where. There has to be a disclosure of exactly what kinds of weapons the Navy used and in what quantities. And this is really where the Navy has been more resistant. Which I would argue is actually understandable, because the information that has come up over the years reveals unlawful and abusive practices, and it also has revealed basically decades of misinformation, and if I may also add, just outright lying too, which creates, if not the grounds for reparations, at least a public relation problems for the Navy, which arguably the Navy already has, at least in Vieques. But what we do know, thinking about Vieques, is that the Navy used in Vieques napalm, Agent Orange, depleted uranium, trioctyl phosphate, and other substances and artifacts that fill the place with heavy metals and other pollutants. Oh. Okay. Oh, okay. Yes. So, okay. So I'll wrap up. I have a lot that I can say, but this can perhaps be addressing the question and answer part, or rather the open discussion part. But I would say this. Right now, post-2003, Viequenses argues that la lucha continúa, the struggle continues, because the Navy has not really left. There's all this waste, this environmental devastation that remains, and that it has been really, really hard for community activists to engage in this part of the struggle, partly because the language now is, let's call it scientific, right? Heavily scientific based. And what has been going on is that basically, if before 2003, people in Vieques were approached for people to learn about their experience and gain knowledge about life in Vieques, now those same people are not actually being listened to because they're actually not scientists, right? And the scientists are, for example, on the part of the federal government, who through different agencies have been insisting that there's no evidence to suggest that there's a relationship between the health crisis in the island, and I can talk about this later on if it comes up, and the higher rates of morbidity and mortality and cancer compared to Puerto Rico and to what could be expected, and the environmental devastation left by 60 years of bombing. So people have been trying to be heard and also engaging the difficulty of engaging in a cleanup process that is many times framed in very technical language, and I would assume that it's a very inaccessible language by design. So I'll leave it at there. Did I take a long time?
I'd like to welcome Patricia Hines, speaking about environmental contamination, U.S. military base legacy. She's retired environmental engineer and professor of environmental health and chair of the board of the Trap Rock Center for Peace and Justice. Thank you, Patricia.
Let me just check this. Yeah, okay.
Good.
First, I want to say good morning. Good morning, everyone. And I want to say that I'm very grateful to be here and grateful for the organizers of the conference. We have had lots of communication among us on the panel, and it's wonderful to be partners with you on this presentation. So let me just say first that it was one of the last points that Pat made, but the majority of Superfund sites in this country are military sites, and they are either explicit military bases or they are military contractors. And so it gives you a sense of both the extent and the toxicity of the hazardous materials that are used by the military and in support of the military. Another thing, as an aside, the Department of Defense resisted being regulated by EPA for their hazardous waste on U.S. bases in the 1980s. The Superfund law was passed in 1980. And then again, post-11, Rumsfeld tried to get out from under the regulation of the EPA, but in both cases failed. Only countries, so given that we do regulate hazardous waste in this country, even if we do a shitty job of it, and even if we don't acknowledge that health effects caused by the waste on site are a result of those wastes, as you said about Vieques, it's said everywhere. That given, only countries considered peers, such as West Germany, have the clout to negotiate cleanup of U.S. bases and nearby contaminated environment by the U.S. and to litigate against civilian contractors. Those countries of primarily non-white peoples have little to none ability to negotiate cleanups in their countries, and that's my subject today. So on the left, you see here, this is the a picture of the Vieques firing range toxic waste, and a quote from a U.S. fish and wildlife biologist, Michael Hadfield, quote, "There is ample evidence that when Marines take an island for live fire training, as they did in Vieques, they ultimately destroy it." And he means the life, that is the ecological life on which our life depends. The photo on the right is an example of a burn pit used on hundreds of U.S. bases for primitive waste disposal, built by civilian military contractors, primarily KBR, and with no pollution controls at all. So what's burned in here? Everything. Chemical, medical waste to plastics, pesticides, and dead bodies. So if you just check the notes on this slide, it gives you very quickly, sketchily, the history of our colonization of the Philippines through 1945, 1903. Actually, maybe the second U.S. foreign base was Subic Bay. That's 1904. And then after we, quote, gave them independence, the neo-colonial relationship continued. And we had, by 1947, an agreement for 23 bases on the island. The bases were critical. Oh, thank you. Is it sort of sound? Okay, thank you. How's that? Like that. Okay. All right. The bases were critical, as were those in Okinawa as well, for our wars in Vietnam, Korea, and the Iraq War. On this map, you see two major bases in the Philippines, former major bases, Subic Bay and Clark Air Force Bay. And I will just note that I visited both of these in the early 1990s after the Philippine Senate had put the U.S. out of the Philippines. And we were taken around by a Philippine feminist non-governmental organization. And we witnessed in Angeles City and Olongapo, the cities near these bases, the social ills created by the U.S. military presence, prostitution, biracial children abandoned by U.S. military fathers, and illness from U.S. base contamination. On this slide, it introduces us to the first reason that the Clark Air Force Base was abandoned by the United States, and they intended to return. Both Subic Bay and Clark were abandoned because of Mount Pinatubo ash, which there were feet of it on both bases, so they were abandoned temporarily. That was in June 1991, and by September 1991, the Philippine Senate had basically voted to put the U.S. base, to have the U.S. bases closed and put the U.S. military presence out of the Philippines. So this is just a profile of the types of contamination on the U.S. base, the Clark Air Force Base. First of all, after the base closures, people displaced by the volcano moved onto the base. And then you see a profile here which is not by any means complete, but typical of all the bases that I'll talk about today. PCBs from transformers, asbestos in buildings. These buildings were built in the 1945 and many of the others, Okinawa, 47, in the 40s and 50s, full of asbestos, which was, if taken out by local people who were then, they have higher cases of asbestosis as a result of it among local workers who have no place to turn in terms of getting medical compensation. Now, underground fuel storage tanks and every contaminant that we have heard of, I think particularly from Pat thus far, all the solvents, the trichloroethylene, toluene, benzene, etc., it's a result of having oil stored in unprotected underground storage tanks, which was de rigueur prior to 1980, 1970, I should say. And so you have tanks in the ground, there's nothing, no concrete encasement, and there's no leak detection system. So as they leak, no one knows, nor were they replaced in an environmentally correct way. So consequently, on every base that I will talk about, and in the United States as well, old bases, you will see this type of contamination. Firefighting chemicals. Of course, they had to practice firefighting training. Sometimes a drunk soldier would release some, and in other cases it was accidental, but they have toxic chemicals in them. So they would spread over the base and probably be washed into drains. Subic Naval Base. This was routine. As long as they were there, almost 4 million gallons of untreated sewage were sent daily through pipes into the local waters, and these waters were used by Filipinos for fishing and for swimming. 2 landfills, again, primitive. They just dug holes very deep, filled it with all sorts of toxic, probably medical waste as well, and then also ordnance disposal areas, very primitive. And so you have, again, on that, the same profile of pollution that we had on Clark Air Force Base. It was estimated by our government after the space was closed that it would cost $25 million to clean it up, but that was without cleaning up groundwater and soil. So the true estimate is more like $50 million. We walked away, of course, because we could. And we have status of forces agreements with the Philippines, but also Okinawa and all of our overseas bases, which free us from the responsibility, the legal responsibility, to clean up and also to address medical health impacts. And as I said, it's only some of our privileged partners in Western Europe, white partners, who have been able to negotiate with our government to do some cleanup. And just a quote from the People's Task Force for Base Cleanup. This is a Filipino group, and Filipino Americans are part of it, that the Philippine government has not been strong enough to force a cleanup of the bases. And this is actually a unique quote. They say he's probably the only person of his type. This is a high-level U.S. officer, Navy, who probably served in the Philippines. But he has said, nowhere in the U.S. are we able to use our military bases, and God knows that they are very contaminated, with less restrictions than we do in the Philippines. All right, so I found in some article Okinawa called the junk heap of the Pacific, and essentially the blue small icons that you see on the map, I'm not sure who's doing this mapping. It could be the U.S. for the sake of basically knowing where we sprayed pesticides so that they could avoid any type of compensation to vets who were there. But this apparently shows where we sprayed pesticides on Okinawa. So why would we be spraying pesticides in Okinawa and every other base that we have? It's a simple way of clearing vegetation. It's a lazy way. And it's what our airports do, civilian airports as well as, and in this case, it would have been Agent Orange because Okinawa stored Agent Orange in barrels for use in Vietnam and then received them back, leaking barrels. A number of them were buried, others just leaked all over the environment, but they were also used. And there's rumors, too, that there was a black market of Agent Orange and other toxic herbicides to local farmers and companies. So, at this Kadena Air Force Base, a very controversial one, in 1964, there were barrels of U.S. military waste discarded on land next to where you see that school playground. The U.S. built the school in 1980s. Land next to the school where these had been dumped, these barrels, were given to the local government, which then filled them in and built a soccer field. In 2013, renovations to the soccer field by the local government. In doing that, barrels were discovered, some having high levels of dioxin, herbicides, arsenic, and PCBs. As I said, it's a common profile across all bases. Parents were not informed. This is U.S. families at that base. Students played on the playground next door. There are no dust control nets used on the remedial site. Dioxin found in nearby water, tests showed that. And then when it rained, this is while cleanup was going on, and flooded the site during renovations, water was pumped in nearby waterways. This is unbelievable quality of cleanup and standards. This picture was provided by Chris Roberts, a former maintenance chief, an American, at the same, this is the same air base. It's a Marine station, U.S. Marine Station Futenma, where he says he unearthed, now this is 1981, 100 barrels, some containing Agent Orange. The water, in 2014, the water nearby this dump site was found contaminated with dioxin. Dioxin is one, if not the deadliest toxin known that are used. Water was 21,000 times government's safety standards. So this is just a typical release. This was accidental, a firefighting foam, but sometimes it's also from practice and others by negligence. And so it's basically washed into drains, contaminating there. So I have a few photos of protests. There's immense protest in Okinawa, and it's counterbalanced by the government, local government, buying contractors off, money coming from Japan, and essentially, so you've got a very split island there, but immense citizen protest. And so, just to sum up, the response of the Japanese government for the burden on Okinawa, as well as the other bases, and the U.S., is that the SOFA relieves us, Status of Forces Agreement, from responsibility, and that any amendment that's happened to the SOFA more recently is essentially useless. Women are on the front lines of protest. Reasons: rape, environmental contamination, noise, traffic, etc. Okay, so I'm going to move quickly because I got the time signal. This is South Korea, and as has been said, I think it was David Vine who said it, that we are going to have smaller number of bases, but they will be larger. And as we close bases, we generously give them over contaminated to the South Korean. And we consider it good real estate. So, and then they build theme parks, but the theme parks are built over things that have been buried. So there's tremendous protest again at many of the bases in South Korea. And there are patterns, and I'm not going to go through this, which are just like Okinawa. South Korean activists and people don't want the bases. The South Korean government keeps them. It benefits them financially, and essentially, I guess they've bought the Kool-Aid about security. And so Korean Americans, again, a nice shot of them protesting U.S. military bases in front of the White House. And quickly, this is a sample of a burn pit. There are 230 at least throughout the Middle East. These are built recently. We can't blame it on the 70s without environmental regulations. Everything is thrown into them, and without pollution controls. This is a map being created by the VA. I'm not sure why. It could be because of medical complaints from veterans who've inhaled those fumes. And I just show this to make the point that that pollution does not stay on base, and there must be nearby towns and villages, communes in Iraq where people are breathing this. And then, of course, when we leave this contaminated base. I'll just add that a couple of these burn pits were built on top of old chemical residue pits. These were Iraqi chemical residues. And in those places, there could be 5 to 10 of them. There's been a real epidemic of brain cancer among veterans returning home from 1 or 2 years there. And one of those veterans, and it's a fatal brain cancer, was Biden's son, Vice President Biden's son. And he served at one of those bases where the burn pit was dug out of an old chemical weapons residue pit. And so 3 slides, we'll wrap it up. This is the pattern of contamination that we see at all of our bases, whether it's here or it's there. And the explanation, there's no need for explanation. It's obvious why these things would be being used. These are the potential health impacts. So you just run through them, and it is every organ of the body. And this is the pattern of policy, as I've said, which is we are protected, no obligation. We give minimal communication with local government. If we discover barrels that were buried in 1980 on the base, we don't tell the local government. And there are no comprehensive health or ecology studies done at these bases, none. And the attitude is, as I said earlier, they're getting good real estate when we give them back. Yeah, okay.
I'd like to welcome Susan Schnall, speaking on Agent Orange, Lasting Legacy of the American War in Vietnam. She's co-coordinator of the Vietnam Agent Orange and Relief Responsibility Campaign and a member for Veterans for Peace.
Thank you. I am beginning to feel like we've heard all of these horrendous stories about how the United States has polluted and continues to pollute bases and the environment around the world. And my topic was, in the words of a very famous prior historical figure, what is to be done? So I will try by giving you examples of what a group, and I just want to mention again, what a group called the Vietnam Agent Orange Relief and Responsibility Campaign, that is a project of Veterans for Peace as well as Vietnam Veterans Against the War, has been working on for many, many years. And a quick reminder to you, you all have heard about Agent Orange dioxin, right? We think this is something that happened many years ago. We just commemorated 55 years during the summer of the initial spraying of Agent Orange dioxin in Vietnam. It began in 1961. It continued until 1971. And I'm just going to quickly go through some of the history. So this is our lasting legacy. It shows you how the land was sprayed from the C-123s across South and Central Vietnam and the damage to the land. It was also sprayed by military helicopters. It was sprayed by men using backpacks directly on the perimeters of about 26, 28 American bases in South and Central Vietnam. So if you take a look at the impact on the land, also take a look at the guys that are using the spraying from the helicopters and from hoses. No protective clothing whatsoever because they were told it's not dangerous to your health. This is the impact, and this is a lasting impact on the land and the people in Vietnam. Children who today, because they or their mothers come in contact with one of the remaining contaminated sites in Vietnam, are born with severe birth defects. This continues today. We also know that there were about 3.4 million Vietnamese who were directly sprayed by the planes. 3.4 million directly impacted. That impact continues to their children. The studies that we have so far have talked about the impact on American veterans and somewhat on the children of American veterans. We have more studies that we can use probably going into the next 50 years or so. And I'll just say it's time for us to assume our responsibility, take care of the children of both American veterans and the children in Vietnam. A telegram in the 1970s that was sent from the White House to the embassy in what was then known as Saigon. The question was, we understand from different communications and from articles that have been written, again, 1970, that there are complaints from the Vietnamese that children are being born with severe birth defects as a result of having been contaminated by the spraying. 1970, we have that telegram. Vietnam veterans, American Vietnam veterans, came home and we're talking about veterans dying from the impact of Agent Orange. And we're now going back into the 1970s. There were complaints from veterans. Vietnam Veterans Against the War began organizing and talking about this issue in 1978. 1978, so we're going back many years. They lobbied Congress for recognition. Congress didn't do much. They began a lawsuit that was settled in 1984. The lawsuit, and part of the problem with that lawsuit, is that it was settled before there were ever open hearings in court. And that's the reason that veterans were so concerned about it. They didn't have a chance to bring in the manufacturers like Monsanto and Dow to talk about the contamination, to talk about what was in the chemicals. And as Pat has mentioned, dioxin is one of the most harmful chemicals known to human beings. It was a major part of the Agent Orange. The issue there with using Agent Orange dioxin is dioxin came about because of the production of, and the quick production of Agent Orange. Chemical companies knew about this. We have memos from 1965 that said, yes, we know Agent Orange is contaminated with dioxin, but number one, this information can't get out because the American public will be enraged and it will cut back on our profits. We have that information. Vietnam veterans, we came home and death came with us. 1991, so let me remind you again, American troops, boots on the ground, left in 1975. It took until 1991 to get Congress to pass what is known as the Agent Orange Act. And what the Agent Orange Act stated is, number one, directs the Department of Defense to send information and reports to the National Academies of Science, the Institute of Medicine, to produce every 2 years all known scientific studies on Agent Orange dioxin, impact on the land, impact on people. So starting in 1991, those studies and that collection of information from countries all over the world began. Also, there was a recognition at that time that there was sarcoma and there were a number of other illnesses that were related to the use of Agent Orange dioxin. This went on for 10 to 12 years. The National Academies of Science would then make their recommendation to the Veterans Administration for recognition of compensation for certain illnesses to American veterans. I know you can't read all of this. I put it up here just to say for the succeeding 12 years, there has been recognition by National Academies of Sciences of different illnesses. Sometimes these illnesses have been recognized by the VA and there has been compensation given to veterans. There was one study done on the children of American female veterans who were based in Vietnam that said for the children of those American female veterans who were born with birth defects, the United States government will recognize them and take care of those children. To date, the children of American male veterans, one illness is recognized, it's called spina bifida. The issue, and just think about it as an economic one, The last report that came out from the Institute of Medicine said we really don't know how many troops passed through Vietnam or were there. The original Institute of Medicine report that came out said, oh, maybe there were about 2.4 million. From IOM 2018, the numbers are now up to 4.8 million. But we don't know where the troops were based. It's astounding. This is what the government is saying. This is what the American military is saying. We don't know how many troops on the ground we had. Therefore, we don't know how many people were injured from the use of Agent Orange dioxin. We have lots of studies that today show that those people that handled the Agent Orange dioxin, they're called the ranch handers because the program was known as Ranch Hand, even though originally it was known as Project Hades. And what they have identified is that the children of those ranch handers that directly handed the chemicals have a 50% incidence increase of birth defects with their children. But this is still not recognized by the American government. This is it's one of the banners that we use when we go to rallies and demonstrations to say, we need to remind you all that you may have forgotten, but American veterans and Vietnamese and children continue to be impacted and die from the use of this Agent Orange dioxin. We formed in about 2004, and the Vietnam Association for the Victims of Agent Orange is an organization of American veterans and social activists that are working on, originally we were working on a legal case because everybody wants to know why haven't we sued the chemical companies and the government, and we have, and we've lost, right? No surprise there. But part of what VORAC does is to educate, raise awareness about the continuing impact of the chemicals that were used during the American War in Southeast Asia. There have been multiple delegations that have come from Vietnam to work with us, and we go to Vietnam, veterans groups. Veterans for Peace goes to Vietnam on an annual basis to meet with the people and to see the parts of the area that continue to be contaminated. We have had multiple delegations going back and forth. And we work on organizing, raising awareness, and part of what we've also done is to work with an organization called the American Public Health Association that has 5,000 members internationally. We've put a science and public health group together that continues, again, to do studies, to take a look at the literature, to say this is the continuing impact of this chemical herbicide on the land and people. And we go to the national meetings every year. We kind of follow APHA around and put our panel together. And we have gone to Vietnam twice to meet with people and to talk about the continuing impact. We're currently doing a study that has identified all of the studies done worldwide on the remaining toxic spots or hot spots in Vietnam, and then take a look at the studies that have been done on the impact on the people. And the most recent studies, actually, that were done by a group of scientists in Japan identified that those areas around Da Nang, until it was cleaned up, showed that women who ate the food continue to have higher levels of dioxin in the blood system, and that in fact that gets transferred to their infants, and that the infants have cognitive delays around 6 to 12 months of age. So the continuing impact. We did get a policy out of the American Public Health Association that stated we recognize that this has had an impact and that we have a responsibility to clean it up. So this was kind of our start of organizing actions following the loss of the legal cases. As I said, we had tours that have gone to major cities, and let me just go back a minute. VAVA, the Vietnam Association for the Victims of Agent Orange Dioxin, was formed as a part of a class action suit representing the Vietnamese and the impact on the Vietnamese for our legal case. VAVA now is a non-governmental organization in Vietnam that raises money, raises education, raises awareness about the impact of the spraying. Part of the problem in Vietnam with a lot of the people in the rural areas felt this has happened to our children. It may happen to 2, 3, 4 of our children, and it's a result of karma. It's a result of what we have done in our past lives. So part of what VAVA has done is to educate the population. No, what has happened is the United States government, the military, left this poison in the land, and it continues to harm your children. So the children. I first visited Vietnam in 2004 and went to a hospital where there were children who were suffering from the impact. And that was kind of the start of my trying to work on this issue. You can see children who have different types of birth defects. The child whose head is thrown back lives at home with her mother. And part of what we're looking at is, and talking about, is what's going to happen when these parents die. The lasting impact on a soldier, the lasting impact, and please take a look at the child down in the left-hand corner. The child who has multiple birth defects, who is being taken care of at home by a sister and a family who give up their lives to take care of those children that were injured by our government. Juan is testifying in front of Representative Falioma Vega's hearing on Agent Orange. This was when we were first working on the legislation, and that legislation eventually was introduced to the House by Representative Filner. It's really important, I think, to mention that originally the person who was going to introduce our legislation was Representative Conyers, and the importance of the legislation is that we talked about healing the wounds of war for the Vietnamese who were impacted by Agent Orange, as well as American veterans. We refuse to bifurcate or separate those issues. Representative Conyers' staff refused to submit our legislation the way we wrote it. So, and it was delayed, and I think that's something that we've all learned about. We lost a year or 2 years because we waited to get him to introduce the legislation. It was eventually introduced by Representative Filner, and again, another a quick picture of our delegation from Vietnam that came and worked with us. Our delegation also went, this is a photo of Da Nang Airport, before the billions of dollars that have been spent in the cleanup. And that's just one part of Vietnam. So it's our Science and Public Health Committee. We now have, and I'm going to mention to all of you, if you're interested in learning more about Agent Orange Dioxin, we have our brochure here. But even more important, we have put together these cards that we need you to sign and give back to me, and we use them to lobby Congress. We currently have legislation in front of the House. It's H.R. 334 that was introduced in 2017 by Representative Barbara Lee. And really important that we get more and more support. Part of what we do now is educate the public, and we educate the politicians, and we educate as many people as we can through conferences like this. Our group that went to Congress a year ago was composed of VAVA, the Vietnam Association for the Victims of Agent Orange, and VORAC. We met with Senator Leahy's aide, Tim Reesner, who said for years people have been organizing and talking with him about the lasting impact of Agent Orange Dioxin. But this was the first time that Vietnamese and American had come together to say we need to do something for both groups who have been harmed. So this is a photo of our enormous group that is composed of Juan, who you see One is missing her 2 lower extremities. Mom was exposed to Agent Orange when she was cleaning up their land and farming. And Heather Bowser, who is on your right, who is standing there. Heather is one of the co-founders of an organization called Children of Vietnam Veterans Health Alliance that is bringing together the children of men who were in Vietnam and who were born with birth defects. So we are, again, I think kind of an interesting organization of both Americans who were in Vietnam as well as the Vietnamese, saying we want to put an end to this lasting legacy of war, and we have a responsibility to do so. And I'll just end to give you a quick summary of what the legislation says. One is the cleanup of the remaining contaminated land in Vietnam. The other is to be able to provide services, not money, but services to both the children of American veterans as well as the Vietnamese who were harmed all those years ago. And a reminder, we are now coming into 56 years later after the spraying. We're seeing the remaining contamination in those military bases in Vietnam, and we see the contamination with the children who are born with severe birth defects. We know from studies that have been done that these children, in fact, were impacted by their father's service. And a reminder to everybody here, these are children who didn't carry a gun, who didn't go to war, who didn't fight. They are the innocent victims of American wars and imperialism all over the world. And we, because we have that knowledge, we have that responsibility to work with people and organize and clean it up. Thank you.
Okay. So I think from these presentations, you understand why we must close bases and we must, and why we must end war, because the war goes on in our bodies and in nature, and it is perpetuated. And I think the stories that you've heard, particularly the kind of mobilization over more than 50 years by those working on Agent Orange, we could say that we need that kind of long-term study and long-term commitment to those in Iraq who've been so impacted by depleted uranium, both the military and civilian U.S. Forces and the people of Iraq, because we know of the terrible birth defects there and the impacts on health. So I just want to call your attention to a handout that is over at the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom table. It's a handout on Our Bodies, Our Health, and it runs through some of the really important issues around the exposure to these contaminants and how they affect women, men, and children, and how it's continued exposure over long periods of time to small doses that can affect the development, as we've heard, of the fetus, impacts the newborn, and it's a lifetime burden that at no time in your life can you really know when disease is going to break out. So it's very important that we really understand the health impacts and we develop mobilization around those and bring in the health professionals and the public health professionals in particular. So we'll now go to some questions.
I'm sorry. So I saw some hands. So I kind of
Yes, please do.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I saw Jerry, and then I saw John, and this gentleman, and let's see how we go from there. We don't have a whole lot of time for questions right now, so I'm going to start on Jerry. Yeah, but live stream can't hear you. We want everybody to hear you.
After questions, we're going to come back, I hope, for a couple of minutes from each of the speakers to suggest next steps.
Well, I want to thank all the panelists. It's really a great presentation, valuable information. I'm so glad to know that not only is this being live streamed, but it's going to be archived and available on YouTube, et cetera, all these panels. So that's fantastic. I wanted to ask Marie Soto Cruz more about the health impacts in Vieques and how that's compounded now by the recent hurricane and flooding and all, the lack of electricity, and how people in the United States can be more in solidarity with the people of Vieques at this time.
Can I respond?
Yes, of course.
Or next
Would you like responses now, Leah?
We don't have time for a lot of questions, but Maria,
Yes.
if you could say something quickly to respond to his question.
Is this on? Yeah. So I would say very quickly that I didn't really get to many of the things that I wanted to say about the health impact in Vieques, but it is not, well, the first thing that I would say is that when we're talking about the people of Vieques, we're talking for the most part about historically a poor population, and that a poor population that is isolated in many ways, that have a really deficient healthcare services within the island. And the hurricane have only made it worse. The hurricane actually, water came into the only, it's not a hospital, it's a clinic. So water came in, it wasn't addressed. Now hongos, mold took over the building, and actually there are now tents outside of the hospital, of the clinic, and that's where people are being treated, right? And that has been the situation for a few months, and there's no understanding of when that will actually stop, because they'll need, obviously, money to fix the building, right? So there's an already health crisis in the island that the federal government does not acknowledge, that community activists insist that there must be resources given to the island to address things like the higher cancer rates, cardiovascular diseases. But in the meantime, people are being basically, they only have an ER, which doesn't even have x-rays. They can't give birth in the island. They can't get dialysis. They have any sort of cancer treatment, nothing. Just the bare minimum. And again, we're talking about a population with scarce resources and that have a really, really bad public transportation system to the main island that depends on a ferry that works whenever it works. And it is very, very difficult.
Thank you for everything that you all have said. Wanted to point out that in Vietnam, north of Hanoi, is a place called Friendship Village. Friendship Village is a hospital, a rehabilitation hospital, a social center, a school, et cetera, and they're always looking for volunteers, people who are willing to go there and serve as a volunteer with your skill, whatever skill you may have or skills. The other issue is that the United States has an arm of the funding source for the Friendship Village, and if you're interested, please see me. My name is John Spitzberg from Willow, Alaska. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Dr. Ben Hong. My background is I'm a medical doctor. I was in private practice for 35 years and then switched over to the VA over the last 10 years. I'm also a retired major in the U.S. Army, and I have first-hand experience of most of the things that you have said here. Unfortunately, I can tell you that a lot of the things that you said here are a little bit kind of old, and that a little bit old information. There are newer information that I may be able to share with you. And the fact also is that it's about only 10% of what really is out there. I cannot say that that you are the tip of the iceberg, because that means that you are on the surface, because there are icebergs that are completely at the bottom that we have not even mentioned here. So I have first-hand experience at Clark Air Base. I was stationed there for 1 year. And I also have experience looking at Subic Bay. I also have experience at the Gulf War. I was deployed there. And so I have experience with the oil fire, because we were sent there. The burn pit, the depleted uranium. And I also had a top secret clearance to go over all our chemical stockpile, which is unbelievable. And so there are a lot of issues that we have not even mentioned here. But in any case, I just want to mention to you that my reason for coming here is because I want the war to stop. And I want to prevent war from happening. That you just don't go to war at the drop of a pin. Right now we're thinking about, well, maybe we should go to North Korea. Officially, I think what we have right now is that we are in 11 countries that we're at war. And somebody has to tell our politicians that war is not just a simple matter of sending our troops there. You have to see somebody in the middle of the war firing and being hit, being surrounded, and so on. And in that kind of situation, human people, the people lose their rationality, and they lose their civilization, whatever civilization they are. They behave like animals. And we are animals when we are at war. And then you see somebody dying and in front of you or helping you. And I was a medical doctor in that situation. So there are things that we need to let our officials know that we cannot just continue like this. Now, if it means closing, all right.
Very quick comment about the environment and all the issues that have been raised. There's one from the previous panel to this one. There's one consistent theme all through all of it, and that's lack of information and the secrecy that constantly surrounds everything the military does. I'm very surprised that during this section, when it's speaking about the environment, not one word about chemtrails. What they are, what they're doing to the environment, what the impact to our future, not just our environmental future, but our democracy. I mean, it's all at risk.
Okay.
Okay.
Chemtrails.
Okay. This gentleman in the back. Please.
It's okay. People need to say this.
My name is Richard Oakes, Baltimore. I was on the board of the Aberdeen Proving Ground Superfund Citizens Coalition for about 5 years, which is a 25-mile stretch, including Edgewood Arsenal, and it has all the open burn pits, depleted uranium, you name it. And it's still there, and but there are technologies for cleaning up. I'm suggesting that people who live around the bases everywhere in the world demand restoration advisory boards. That's the protocol for cleanup in cooperation with the Army and other stakeholders and residents who live around there. There's one in Fort Detrick and Frederick as well. We have one up here at Aberdeen. And that's local citizens and all stakeholders, including Army personnel, all share information on restoring the contaminated areas. The other thing that can be done maybe at Vieques, if the EPA has any jurisdiction in our territories, is to sue the EPA to help out the cleanup and restoration in Vieques. And you should also demand a restoration advisory board. The other thing is to share technologies. There's cleanup technologies for restoration that have been perfected at Aberdeen and other places that outlaws open burning and outlaws even incinerators, and has chemical neutralization techniques. And the fourth suggestion would be take it to the International Criminal Court, because these are high crimes against humanity.
Do any of the panelists have a response to the comments made yet? No? Yes, so are there any other questions? Leah, where are you?
Yeah,
Yes.
very quickly, I think it's probably not news to many of us that a vice president's son and attorney general of Delaware was very likely killed by open burn pits, but it is, to my knowledge, it just got in the corporate media this week that Biden, the former vice president, read Joseph Hickman's book and acknowledges the conclusions that his son was likely killed by open burn pits. So if everybody in this room would write a letter to the editor, call a show, get into the media the fact that it's not just a famous individual, it's thousands of Americans and tens and hundreds of thousands of Iraqis and Afghans killed by these things, and the cleanup needs to be done, and done now by the United States. It might be a way into the corporate monopolized communication system we've got going.
I'm sorry, we don't have time for any more audience comments or questions, but the panel wants to make short closing remarks, and then we have an announcement.
Okay. Would you like to start?
I guess just a quick sum up that I think we've all been talking about. One is that people need to get involved. Some of it involves communities that are right around the military bases. Some of it involves, and it certainly took me a while to say, yeah, I need to get involved in electoral politics. I need to go to the federal government, to the representatives in the House and to the Senate, and say there needs to be payment for these crimes of war, to educate them and to get more and more people involved. And just quickly, we have 23 co-sponsors of our legislation in the House. We need more people to keep doing this. And I guess my presentation was one to say we need community involvement. We need to have those surrounding the areas that are completely impacted by what's happening. And we need to get involved with our politicians, with the powers that be. And I just leave you with this one piece of information. Monsanto, that was a major producer of the contaminated Agent Orange that devastated Southeast Asia, is now back in Vietnam selling their GMOs. So we have major struggle ahead of us. And it's kind of a plea to say we need to learn how to work together in coalitions and organizations, because we're all concerned about saving the human beings, saving, I don't know anymore, saving life on the earth and saving the land. And it's kind of a plea for us to figure out, how do we communicate, how do we get bigger, and how do we educate, and how can we do it together?
Patricia.
Good. You ended where I'll begin, and it's also a point David Vine made earlier in his strategic, how do we build larger coalitions, and also looking at the demographics here and our ages. I'll just tell a story and link it back to our panel. I was invited to speak by 350.org, that's climate change, in Connecticut, and they wanted to bring together the New Haven Peace Coalition, and they wanted me to speak on climate change and militarism. Mm-hmm. And there's a tremendous relationship, as you all, the military is the major polluter of climate. So I got there to speak, and on the left side is 350.org, and they all average about 35 years old. And on the right side is the New Haven Peace Coalition. Since the 1950s and nuclear weapons, then the average age was about 75 years old. And I realized, well, first of all, I'll just tell you that I raised that to the audience after I spoke a bit, and a guy stood up from the left side, 350.org, and he said, in my lifetime, he says, I'm not really preoccupied with war. He said, in my lifetime, there's been no use of a nuclear weapon, but in my lifetime, there has been climate change. And so I realized this is an uphill battle. I mean, in terms of how do you begin to change someone's experience? I mean, you can't change it, but what they're thinking because of their life experience. But I just want to say that I do think that the importance of this panel, in addition to the reality itself of building wider coalitions and especially attracting youth, could be this bridge between environmental pollution, climate change, and and militarism, because they lean to the left. This is young people in terms of their interest in it and their passion for environmental pollution and especially climate change, but not only. And then I think to build those bridges of connection could be a way to widen this coalition. I will just add too another thought that occurred to me. Mayors of cities, they are much more interested in the infrastructure and the money they're not getting from the federal government because of what's going into the military. And rather than, I mean, not rather, in addition to working at the federal level with legislators, I would say that we've got a ready audience with the mayors. They make statements every year at their mayor's conference anyway about this. Okay.
Sure, just very quickly, I think we need to also pay attention to our individual states. I think that we are already seeing the Trump administration's dictates filter down to various state environmental protection agencies. For instance, in Maine, there's a memorandum that came out of that rabidly reactionary governor's office regarding environmental protection at the Bath Iron Works. And basically it says, if the military exceeds discharge levels in particular contaminants, it's okay, because we have to keep in mind that there are financial and economic interests involved here, and that should trump. So look at your EPAs in your own individual states. The state of Maryland, for instance, routinely allows phosphorus to be discharged by military installations into the Potomac and really doesn't pitch a fit. So there's work to be done at the state level. It's not tough. Go to that ProPublica site and then Google, what you find as far as contaminants are concerned, and then pull up your own state's environmental protection regulations. It's really not tough stuff to understand, and delve into it. Thank you.
Okay.
I had one comment about the Restoration Advisory Board in Vieques. In the case of Vieques, I'm thinking about the Superfund, and it's just a critique made by Viequenses and community activists, basically saying that the Superfund stipulates for community engagement through the Restoration Advisory Boards, which ultimately take the shape of 4 meetings a year, but there's no real stipulation about how to deal with the input of the community members. And so community members feel that they're often talked down to and basically ignored. Even thinking about technologies like closed detonation chambers that the community has been pushing for a long time in terms of open air detonations, and just being constantly ignored. So instead of it being like a space to exchange ideas and take people seriously, it's just sort of, co-opting dissent, basically. Mm-hmm. The other thing that I would like to say is that another way to think about making connections would be to think about reproductive rights, because in my understanding, there's a way in which to think about reproductive rights is ultimately the right to envision a future for yourself and your community. And part of what I think we're talking about is the inability for certain groups of people and for humanity collectively to envision a future in the earth in which we are inhabiting, right? So another way to think about it would be reproductive rights. And maybe then the last thing that I would say is about thinking about support for Vieques maybe. There are a lot of organizations on the ground doing a great work, and support them, reach out for them. They need networks of solidarity. They also need money too. And also, I think another important thing would be to the power of the story, of the narrative, right? To get it out there, to keep it circulating, especially thinking about spaces like Vieques that are in many ways doubly colonial, right? We have no official representation, yet the U.S. federal government has total control over Puerto Rico, right? So we need the story to resonate within the U.S., in the U.S. mainland, with actual U.S. citizens who seem to matter as opposed to, Puerto Rican colonial ones. So I think that carries a lot of weight. Yeah.
So, thank you very much. Before we depart for lunch, I would just like to remind you to go and get your, thank you very much. Before we depart for lunch, I would just like to remind you to go and get your copy of Gar Smith's War and the Environment, the reader. It's full of information about environmental impacts and health impacts and consequences from militarism and war and bases as well. Oh, it's for sale out there? Oh, wonderful, terrific. Back table in the corner, terrific. And also, I'd like to remind you that this panel, in a way, is a continuation of the discussion that occurred on war and the environment at the 2017 World Beyond War Conference last September. So you can go to the worldbeyondwar.org website. You can click on the menu bar to events. You can click then on the drop-down menu of recent events, and that will take you to all the videos of that conference, which is a terrific resource for information about the environment. There were 2 panels on that issue in particular that are very important to look at as background to this particular these particular presentations, where we were trying to emphasize health and really bring health and the contaminants that contribute to such ill health back into the conversation, to broaden that conversation, also bring the public health professionals, the medical professionals, and the scientists who deal with these issues of the contaminants back into the discussion to broaden the movement. Thank you very much.